By the next morning, Tom woke up to find news vans parked outside his house. Reporters were knocking on his door, asking for interviews. He hadn't wanted fame, only fairness. But now, his story was a symbol of something much bigger: how homeowners associations could lose sight of humanity behind their obsession with control. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Their inbox was flooded, their phones ringing nonstop. The president of the board, a woman named Cheryl Davenport, released a statement saying the issue was under review, but the tone was defensive, even smug. She claimed that the HOA wasn't discriminating, but upholding standards that all residents agreed to when moving in. The statement only made things worse. Local news ran the story for days. Online communities dissected the HOA's letter line by line, exposing contradictions in their own bylaws. A group of veterans even organized a peaceful rally outside the HOA office, carrying signs that read "Accessibility is not a violation" and "Honor those who served." Meanwhile, Tom sat quietly in his living room, overwhelmed by the support but exhausted by the chaos. He hadn't meant to start a movement. He just wanted a ramp. But now, the story had grown beyond him. One night, as the camera lights faded and reporters left, Tom looked out the window at his muddy front steps. The rain had washed away the footprints of the crowd, but something had changed forever. The neighborhood that once seemed perfect now felt like a battlefield. Between the neighborhood of Willow Creek was the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Trimmed hedges, painted mailboxes, uniform driveways, the kind of community where the lawns all looked like they were cut with a ruler. But behind that pristine image lurked an HOA board that took rules more seriously than human decency. Tom Callahan had lived there for 8 years. A quiet man in his early 50s, he was a retired Army veteran who'd bought his modest home with dreams of peace and normalcy. After years of service overseas, he wanted nothing more than calm mornings on his porch, his dog Max at his feet, and a simple life surrounded by good neighbors. For a while, he had that. But that peace was interrupted when an accident left him wheelchair-bound. A car crash, just a few blocks from home, had fractured his spine. After months of surgeries and rehab, he was finally able to return home, but the front steps that once felt ordinary now felt like an impossible wall. His small house had just 3 steps leading to the front door, but to him, they might as well have been a mountain. He knew what he needed: a ramp. Nothing fancy, nothing excessive. Just a safe way to get into his own home. His son offered to help build it, and within a few days, they had drawn up a simple design: a clean, wooden ramp that matched the house's look. It would be built to code, painted neatly, and wouldn't block anyone's view. Before construction began, Tom did what he thought was right. He submitted a request to the HOA for approval. After all, that was the process: a simple form, a short explanation, and usually a rubber stamp approval for small modifications. He mailed it off, thinking it would be approved without question. But a week later, the letter arrived. The HOA denied his request. Their reasoning was as cold as it was absurd: the proposed structure does not align with the aesthetic standards of the community. They went on to say that ramps, being external modifications, must maintain the uniform appearance of front-facing entries. Tom read it 3 times, then a 4th. His hands trembled as he realized what it meant. They were telling him that accessibility was less important than appearances. At first, he thought it was a misunderstanding. Surely, if he spoke to someone, they'd see reason. So he called the HOA office and explained the situation. Calmly, respectfully, with hope in his voice. But the woman on the other end gave him the same rehearsed response about policy and neighborhood standards. Tom tried appealing the decision. He sent them his doctor's notes, his rehabilitation records, even photos of how small and tasteful the ramp would be. But the board stood firm. They claimed it would negatively impact property values. It was then that frustration gave way to anger. He had served his country, paid his dues, and always followed the rules. But now, he was being told that his basic need for mobility was a nuisance. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was raining, and Tom tried to maneuver his wheelchair up the steps using a temporary wooden plank his son had made. The wheels slipped and he toppled sideways. His neighbor, an older woman named Jean, rushed to help him back up. The embarrassment was worse than the pain. Sitting there in the mud, drenched and humiliated. Tom realized he couldn't fight this quietly anymore. That night, his son recorded a short video. It wasn't scripted or dramatic, just Tom sitting in his living room, explaining what had happened. He showed the denial letter from the HOA and described how impossible it was for him to safely enter his own home. There was no anger in his tone, only quiet disbelief. His son uploaded the video to a veteran support group on Facebook. It got a few comments of sympathy at first, then a few shares, then hundreds. Within 24 hours, it had spread across multiple platforms. Reddit, TikTok, Twitter. People were furious. The hashtags started forming. Hashtag let Tom build his ramp and hashtag HOA heartless. Users began tagging local news outlets, disability rights groups, and veteran organizations. Strangers from across the country left comments offering donations, legal help, and even to come build the ramp themselves. Decency and vanity. And as he stared at those 3 stubborn steps, he knew one thing for sure: the fight wasn't over yet. The morning after the news story aired, Willow Creek didn't look the same. The street that once prided itself on perfect uniformity now had a small crowd of camera crews, reporters, and curious residents lingering outside. Cars slowed down as they passed Tom's home. Some drivers rolled down their windows to shout words of encouragement, while others simply honked and waved. Tom's house, once anonymous among a row of identical facades, had become a symbol. To many, it was the house that stood up to an oppressive HOA. To others, it was proof that ordinary people could fight back against systems that valued appearance over compassion. The HOA board, on the other hand, was in full panic mode. Overnight, their website's contact form had been bombarded with thousands of angry messages. Their official social media accounts were flooded with comments, tagging them in viral posts and memes that mocked their decision. Someone even created a parody account called the Heartless HOA, which posted fake rule updates like no breathing on Tuesdays and wheelchairs must match the neighborhood color palette. Cheryl Davenport, the HOA president, tried to regain control. She scheduled a closed-door meeting to discuss the public relations situation, but word got out anyway. Residents whispered in driveways, sharing screenshots and gossip. Some sided with Tom. Others feared the HOA's retaliation. But one thing was clear: the entire neighborhood was divided. Meanwhile, the story continued to gain momentum online. News outlets from across the country picked it up, framing it as veteran-denied wheelchair ramp by HOA. Disability rights groups joined in, releasing public statements condemning the HOA's actions. Several well-known influencers made reaction videos, reading the HOA's letter aloud with disbelief and outrage. Then came the turning point. A national veterans advocacy organization started a petition on Tom's behalf. It demanded that Willow Creek's HOA reverse their decision and issue a formal apology. Within 48 hours, the petition had over 500,000 signatures. Donations poured in from people offering to cover the cost of legal action or help fund accessibility upgrades for disabled homeowners across the country. Tom's son, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, began posting updates. Each post gathered thousands of comments, stories from others who had faced similar discrimination, people with disabilities sharing their struggles with HOAs, veterans recounting their own battles with bureaucracy. But while the internet was cheering for Tom, the HOA's response grew colder. They issued a formal statement claiming they were being harassed, and that the residents' viral post misrepresented the facts. They insisted they had offered alternative options for accessibility, though none had ever been communicated to Tom. Cheryl even went as far as to say that Tom's house had become a media circus and was disrupting the peace of the community. That statement was their biggest mistake yet, because the internet doesn't forgive, and it certainly doesn't forget. Within hours, people dug up old HOA newsletters and public records. They discovered that Cheryl herself had approved an exception for another homeowner 2 years earlier, allowing her friend to build a decorative gazebo that technically violated HOA rules. Screenshots of that approval letter spread like wildfire, along with photos of Cheryl's own backyard, which included a shed that didn't match the required neighborhood paint code. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Now, the HOA wasn't just seen as heartless, they were seen as corrupt. The local news picked up on the new revelations, and by the following morning, Cheryl's face was plastered across headlines. The board tried to issue takedown requests for defamatory content, but it was too late. The story had grown beyond their control. Inside Tom's house, the atmosphere was surreal. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Friends from his old unit called to check in, expressing pride and outrage in equal measure. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to dropped off meals and offered to help with errands. For the first time in months, Tom felt something he hadn't since before his accident. A sense of belonging. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but now that he was one, he felt a quiet determination to see it through. Then came the letter, delivered by hand, slipped into his mailbox late at night, stamped with the HOA's seal. It wasn't an apology, far from it. The board accused Tom of defaming the association and warned that continued non-compliance could result in fines. They even threatened legal action if he proceeded with any construction without renewed approval. Tom read it twice, then placed it on his kitchen table. His son wanted to post it online immediately, but Tom stopped him. This wasn't about anger anymore, it was about principle. He wanted to win the right way. The next morning, he contacted a local attorney who specialized in disability rights. The lawyer, already familiar with the viral story, offered to take the case pro bono. Together, they reviewed the HOA's covenants and state laws. What they found changed everything. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, HOAs could not deny reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities, including accessibility ramps. What the HOA had done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. When Tom's lawyer sent a formal notice citing these laws, the HOA board went silent. For days, there was no response. Then, a new letter arrived, this time much more careful in tone. The board stated they were re-evaluating their decision pending legal counsel. But by then, it didn't matter. The internet had already turned the story into a national conversation. TV pundits debated it on morning shows. Commentators labeled it a modern David versus Goliath story. And while the HOA tried to retreat into silence, their reputation was in ruins. Behind the scenes, several board members began resigning. Some couldn't handle the backlash. Others quietly admitted they disagreed with Cheryl's decision from the start. One even leaked internal emails showing how the board had mocked Tom's video before it went viral. By the end of that week, the HOA's foundation had cracked, not from force, but from public accountability. And Tom, who only wanted a ramp, had become the catalyst for something far greater. Still, the fight wasn't over. Cheryl and the remaining board members weren't going down without a fight. They were preparing a new round of statements, trying to shift blame and rewrite history. But what they didn't know was that Tom's story was about to take one final, explosive turn. One that would play out live, in front of millions of viewers. The storm that had started in a single neighborhood had now swept across the nation. By the time the third week rolled around, the HOA's reputation was in tatters, and every move they made only seemed to dig them deeper. But they weren't ready to surrender. Cheryl Davenport, the board president, still believed she could regain control of the narrative. She arranged for a formal HOA press conference. A chance, she claimed, to clarify misunderstandings and restore dignity to the community. The problem was that dignity couldn't be restored when the world was already watching. The conference was set up in front of the Willow Creek HOA office, a bland beige building that now carried the weight of national attention. Reporters gathered with cameras, microphones ready, while dozens of locals stood nearby holding signs in support of Tom. The words "accessibility is a right" and "let him build it" waved above the crowd like banners of quiet defiance. Cheryl appeared nervous but determined as she approached the podium. Her statement was carefully worded, filled with legal phrases and vague attempts to sound compassionate. She claimed the HOA had simply been following protocol, and that the situation had been taken out of context. She even went as far as to say that Tom's video had been misleading. But just as she was finishing her speech, a voice from the crowd interrupted. It wasn't loud, just clear enough to be heard. Someone shouted, "So why'd you let your friend build a gazebo?" The crowd erupted. The reporters turned, microphones swinging toward the question. Cheryl froze, visibly rattled. She stammered, tried to recover, but the damage was done. The hypocrisy that had been uncovered online was now being confronted face to face, on live television. That clip would go viral within minutes, spreading across social media faster than anything that had come before. The internet dubbed it the gazebo moment. Overnight, it became the defining image of the scandal. Cheryl's stunned expression as the crowd turned against her. Within days, 2 more board members resigned. By the end of the week, Cheryl herself stepped down, citing personal reasons. The HOA announced that an interim committee would take over while they reassessed internal policies. It was a quiet admission of defeat, wrapped in bureaucratic language. For Tom, it felt surreal. He hadn't celebrated. He hadn't gloated. He just sat on his porch one morning, watching as the neighborhood slowly returned to something resembling normal. But normal wasn't the same anymore. People who once avoided him now waved. Neighbors who had quietly disapproved of the HOA's strictness started speaking openly about reform. It was his attorney who gave him the final piece of good news. The HOA had officially reversed its decision. Not only could he build his ramp, but they would cover all associated costs and issue a public apology for their misunderstanding. The letter, this time, was written in language so careful it almost sounded fearful. Still, Tom didn't want revenge. He just wanted his life back. A few days later, a group of volunteers arrived. Veterans, neighbors, even a few strangers who had driven in from nearby towns after following the story online. They brought lumber, tools, and paint. They didn't need to ask what to do. They simply got to work. Tom watched from his porch as the ramp began to take shape, each board nailed down with a mix of precision and pride. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, but to Tom, it was music. It wasn't just a ramp being built. It was a symbol, a declaration that decency and compassion could still win against arrogance and control. When it was finished, the ramp looked perfect, simple, sturdy, and matching the house so neatly that even the old HOA guidelines would have approved. But this time, approval didn't matter. It stood as proof that people, when united, could change even the most rigid systems. The day after it was completed, a small ceremony took place. A local news crew came to cover it, but this time it wasn't about controversy. It was about closure. Tom, wearing his favorite veteran's cap, thanked the volunteers quietly. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. The image of him rolling up the ramp for the first time said everything words couldn't. That clip, just 20 seconds long, became one of the most shared videos of the year. It was titled "The Ramp They Tried to Stop." It spread across platforms with millions of views, a simple moment of justice that resonated far beyond the borders of Willow Creek. People called it inspiring. Some called it healing. For many, it was a reminder that kindness could still outshine cruelty, even in the most unexpected corners of life. In the months that followed, the ripple effect of Tom's story continued. Lawmakers referenced it in discussions about strengthening accessibility laws in HOA communities. Disability rights advocates cited it as an example of the power of collective voices. Even other HOAs quietly updated their policies to include clearer accommodations for residents with disabilities. As for Willow Creek, things changed too. The new HOA committee rewrote its bylaws, this time with a focus on inclusion and empathy. They even invited Tom to serve as an honorary advisor, a gesture he politely declined, though he appreciated the sentiment. He didn't want to run the HOA. He just wanted to live his life peacefully again. On quiet evenings, Tom would sit on his porch with Max at his side, watching the sunset paint the street in warm colors. The ramp beside him blended naturally into the home. Not a statement anymore, just a part of life. Sometimes, passing neighbors would stop to chat, no longer strangers but friends. Every so often, someone new would drive by, slowing down to take a picture or leave a note of thanks. Many of them had followed his story online, and now they wanted to see where it all happened. Tom always greeted them with the same calm smile. He never thought of himself as a hero. He wasn't looking for fame or sympathy. He was just a man who wanted the right to enter his own home, and in the process, reminded the world that compassion shouldn't need permission. And as the final light faded over Willow Creek, the quiet hum of evening settling in, the ramp, that simple wooden ramp, stood as a silent victory. Not just for Tom, but for everyone who had ever been told no, when they needed understanding instead. It was more than wood and nails. It was proof that when decency and determination meet, even the coldest rules can be rewritten. And that's how a small act of resistance in a quiet neighborhood became the ramp heard round the world.